God as our standard, that enables us to distinguish consistently and on principle between sin and crime, between personal morality and civil legality, between social ethics and political ethics. That is to say, we can distinguish between where the state may properly legislate and where it may not interfere. And it's just here that I would, as a guest to your country, and with genuine humility, suggest a warning to those of you who are in the Christian Heritage Party, that as you do what I think God would call on you to do in trying to bring Christian standards to bear on government, that you not exceed the limit of a biblical view of the state by proposing interference in the free market, interference in international trade, propose interference in matters of welfare and education that are none of the state's business. All the good intentions in the world will not allow you to stand right before God when you overstep His boundaries for the state. In principle, if you overstep those boundaries out of good Christian intention, then anybody else has the right to overstep those boundaries, whether they're Christian or not. If Jesus is the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings, you must do not only what He asks you to do, you must not do what He gives you no permission to do. And so that is just a polite and a humble warning to those of you who are interested in the Christian Heritage Party as you look at the development of your public policies. To preserve liberty, the state must be restrained. It must be kept within the boundaries of God's law, so that the state enforces only what God permits it to enforce. The way that Paul looked upon the civil magistrate, even the emperor in Rome, was that the magistrate is a minister of God who avenges wrath against evildoers. A minister of God. And therefore those who rule in the state owe their allegiance first and foremost to God who put them in power. And they are to do what God has commanded them to do. They are to be an avenger of wrath against those who are evildoers. And remember that evil is defined by Paul as the violation of God's law. They are to punish those who would violate God's law and to punish them in the way God has prescribed. Unless civil rulers serve God by enforcing His just laws against criminal behavior, they will indeed bear the sword in vain. They'll have the coercive power, but it will be futile. It will be morally vain rather than used for the purposes of God. The political use of God's law to punish and restrain crime is precisely what Paul called a lawful use of the law in 1 Timothy 1, verses 8 to 10. And so it cannot be deemed out of place in the New Testament to use the law of God to restrain criminals. Because Paul says, we know the law is good if a man uses it lawfully, and then he illustrates a lawful use of the law in its political application to restrain criminal behavior. Since the civil magistrate has been commissioned to bear a sword for the punishment of evildoers, according to the avenging wrath of God, the magistrate will of necessity need the law of God to inform him as to how and where God's wrath is to be worked out in the state against evildoers. If we repudiate the penal directives of the law of God, we will be rebelling against the notion that magistrates are ministers of God, not ministers of themselves. They don't make up for themselves out of their own sense of indignation and anger how to punish people. They are to mediate God's judgment upon evildoers because they minister for the Most High. Those who would take the form of office, being a minister of God, but then rule according to their own autonomous direction, have the form without the substance. In that sense, they are guilty of political autonomy and therefore guilty of rebellion against the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. You do not have the right, no matter how you came to office, to defy the political wisdom and the direction of God in His most holy word, no matter who you are or where you live or at what time in human history. And so the state, if it would preserve liberty, must be limited to the law of God. And if we would be free of tyranny and the autonomy of men, we must see to it that the state enforces the law of God. What we really have before us, my friends, is a choice between two options. There's only two options. And if you doubt that, I'll be glad to discuss with you. You throw whatever one you want to me, and I'll show you how it reduces to these two. The two options are that we're going to see our magistrates rule in a theocratic fashion, or we're going to endorse the position of legal positivism. Now let me define those two for you, because there's a lot of misunderstanding. When I speak of a theocracy, what I mean literally is the rule of God. Now, how does the rule of God come to expression? There are a lot of different views of that. Some people think the rule of God comes to expression through his chosen leaders. Others say it comes to expression by means of his revealed principles. Others would say it comes to expression in the person of his own Son. Okay, so I know the word is subject to a lot of different interpretations. The word is variously used by writers for instance, the uniqueness of Old Testament Israel. In that sense, I don't endorse a theocracy. But others would use the word for any social system where the law of God is seen as the final standard for political rule. The rule of God by means of his revealed principles. In that sense, I do believe in a theocracy, of course. I would think any Christian would have to believe in a theocracy unless they think Jesus doesn't rule over the state. I've already warned you, some people think a theocracy is the rule of the church. I do not believe in the rule of the church over the state. I do not believe that we wait for Jesus to come back physically to rule over earth in order to have the rule of God here. Very simply, when I use the word theocracy, I mean God's rule mediated through his word. His rule by means of his law over the civil magistrate. That's one of the options. In one way or another, if you believe that there's an accountability of the civil magistrate to Jesus Christ as Lord, you may not agree with everything that I've said in this conference, but in general, if you hold to that view, you hold to a theocratic view of the state. Now, if you do not hold to a theocratic view of the state, the only other option is what we call legal positivism, or the imperative theory of law. According to legal positivism, all laws are merely the commands of a human sovereign, so that there is no conceptual connection between law and justice. That is, laws are whatever are decreed by the civil magistrate. If the magistrate decrees it, it's a legitimate law. And it doesn't have to have any relationship, conceptual or whatever, to justice or to a higher moral standard. In that case, those within a legal system are unconditionally obligated to obey its laws, however immoral they may be. Of course, the classic 20th century example of legal positivism is the Third Reich of Adolf Hitler, where laws were decreed and people were under obligation to obey those laws regardless of their view of the justice or morality of the law. The law is a legitimate law because it's been decreed by the magistrate. Now, what I'm telling you is those are the only two options: theocracy or legal positivism. We must have a higher law, or else we're going to be left with despotism. If we say that laws are whatever the political sovereign imposes on us, then we have no appeal against injustice or abuse. There must be a necessary connection between civil law and morality, or you end up with cultural relativism. And the cultural relativists cannot condemn any kind of oppression or any kind of immorality. If the majority wants something in a society and the law is decreed, that makes it right on the legal positivist approach. And therefore you cannot object against any law. You see why I'm saying that if you don't hold to a theocratic view, whether you know it or not, you are logically committed to tyranny. You're not emotionally or personally committed. You may not be choosing tyranny, but logically you cannot escape it. You have no answer to the tyrant, no answer to the despot, no answer to the Idi Amins and the Hitlers of this world. if you say law is whatever the people make it, whatever the sovereign decrees, rather than law is answerable to a higher divine law, God's law. Without a moral justification for legal punishment, to put it very simply, there's no difference between crime and the punishment of crime. It's just a matter of what's voted in. What you call crime is the very same thing that you're doing when you punish people. It's just that 51% call this punishment, and they call that crime. There are no legitimate distinctions between crime and punishment beyond the consulting of the decree of the magistrate, or in one case, the 51% majority. In that case, we don't really need judges and lawyers. They're only making money going through the game anyway. What we need in our day and age are revolutionary anarchists who can liberate us from the inhumanity of one group of men against another group of men. We may need revolutionary anarchists to liberate us from the 51% tyranny that has no relationship to the morality of God's law. But then, of course, revolutionary anarchy, complete individualism, is either uncivilized, the law of the jungle where the strongest bully gets to rule, or it opens the door to despotism of another sort. Now we have the despotism of the differing organized bullies called mafias or families in society. The only way in which we can avoid the despotism of legal positivism or the despotism of revolutionary anarchy is by having an objective, universal concept of justice that calls for the respecting of the rights of others, limits the authority of the state, and grants freedom to the citizens within that context. William Penn put it very well. He said, "Men must choose to be governed by God, or they condemn themselves to be ruled by tyrants."